Welcome to this Microsoft Flow best practice session. And first off, let's thank all the sponsors who make this event possible, and there are plenty of sponsors. I'm Serge Luca. My friend called me Dr. Flow, so you can call me Serge. I will tell you something, I'm not a real doctor, right? So I don't do injections, for instance. I'm based in Brussels, I'm a SharePoint MVP, and I've used Microsoft workflow in SharePoint since the beginning of the tool. I've worked a little bit with the Microsoft workflow team, the .NET workflow team. And now we have a new tool, Microsoft Flow, so I've jumped on it since the beginning of the product. So what I want to do in this session is to share you all the experience I've done, because I've worked on several Microsoft Flow projects, in real projects. So I want to share this experience, okay? Because basically, yes? Okay, because basically many customers are moving to Office 365, so they have to take some decision. Are we going to use or to buy a third-party tool like Nintex OK2, or is Flow good enough? Okay, so let's try to answer this question. And for this, I also need the help of Isabelle. Yes, by the way, before going to Isabelle, I'm also the author of the masterclass Microsoft Flow that I deliver across Europe. So you can go to my website, shareql.com, to have more details about this. Isabelle, up to you.
So, hello, I'm Isabelle. I'm from Brussels too. And actually, I'm not a SharePointer. I'm a data platform MVP for 6 years now, and I've been working on the product since 20 years. So I'm just doing the BI part into the session and helping Serge with some stuff.
Yeah, so here we'll see the integration between Microsoft Flow and Power BI, okay? Which is important. Thank you, Isabelle. First off, how many people here have used Flow? Because this is supposed to be an advanced Flow session, so we are supposed to already have used Flow. Okay, most of you, I would say 85%, 86%. Okay, that's good. Anyway, I will start from scratch, but I will quickly go into the details, okay? This is the agenda. And first, we'll start talking about the concept in general, quickly, how to create Flow, how to use Flow and on-prem, the concept of environment and data loss prevention, also how to extend Flow, so how can Flow communicate with the outside world, and how can the outside world communicate with Flow. And if you have time, we'll talk a little bit about price and roadmap, at least what you need to be aware of, not the whole price and roadmap, but what you need to be aware of if you want to start a real-world project. So the concept, most of you know Flow, so there are, well, at least I see 4 main benefits to Flow. And first, it's a tool that can improve personal productivity, so you can create personal Flow that will do many things. Also, it's a tool that can improve collaboration across the enterprise. Example, we have a great Flow approval system in Microsoft Flow, which is going to be even better in the coming months. So this is important for collaboration. People should be able to approve or reject or do something else on your assets. Also, it's a tool which is important, which is part of a philosophy called citizen development, where people can create business application, I would not say without writing code, but without writing a lot of code. Because writing code now is getting more and more complex. We have a web stack that takes a lot of time to get into this web stack. So maybe do we have alternative like Power Apps, like Power BI and Flow. Also, Flow is a bridge between applications, because in Flow we have connectors, and we have 257 connectors that allow you to connect Flow to many applications, and not just Microsoft applications. So that's very, very interesting. Also, the context at Microsoft is the context of business apps, and even this slide should have been upgraded, because Microsoft sees business application as a 3 pillars philosophy. We have the first pillar, which is measure. Measure, that means we are going to create dashboard, that's Power BI. Act, that means we are going to create electronic form, we are going to act on data, that's basically Power Apps. And the third is automate, so we are going to automate things, and that's flow, as you will see in the next part here. Also, you need to be aware of that now Business App is part of Dynamics 365. In Dynamics 365, you have, of course, the CRM, the ERP. So this is mission critical. And Flow and Power Apps are supposed to power this component. So it's not a toy anymore, right? So it is important. Whatever you're going to create with Microsoft Flow, easily, can be extended by developers, by specialists. Example, in Microsoft Flow, you can, if you want, connect Microsoft Flow to Azure function. You can call the Graph API and do whatever you want. So you will never be stuck. If you want, you can ask a developer to make some nitty-gritty things, if you want. That's important for the enterprise. Okay. So you need to know this. So Power Apps and Flow are now the building blocks for Microsoft CRM and Microsoft ERP, that's Dynamics 365. So when Microsoft will create new component in Dynamics 365, they will use Power Apps and Flow. And in Dynamics 365, the workflow engine is going to be Flow. We have what we call the business process flow that is coming up soon. So this illustrates the flow running in Dynamics 365. That's something that should ship soon. So we'll get something like this. I cannot point with my pointer here. Yeah, but I think something is an issue with the battery. Anyway, sorry about that. So this is the flow in Dynamics 365. And that's important to know this, because many companies wonder if Microsoft will invest a lot of money and time in Flow in the future? Can we bet the company on Flow? Well, they will do that for themselves, so it's probably very important for Microsoft. So we will have to live with Flow for many years, I believe. So how can you create Flow? You probably know all this stuff. To create Flow, you need a Microsoft account, which is free. There are limitations with this free account. Or most people will use their Office 365 account. If you have Office 365, you have Flow. That's why many companies want to start with Flow from scratch. Or you can directly buy a dedicated Flow plan. If you buy Power Apps, you get also Flow automatically. You go to flow.microsoft.com or you go to powerapps.microsoft.com. You can create a flow directly from a modern SharePoint document library or SharePoint list, even though you can connect classic SharePoint document library and classic list to Flow. That also works. You can also use the mobile, so you can create Flow by using the Flow mobile application, even though most people will never do that. I never do that. It's too small. But you will use the notification settings from Flow. So if your Flow application is installed on your mobile phone, then your Flow running in the cloud can send notification, and you get notification in your smartphone, which is quite a common scenario that we'll see. Okay. Also, we can also have some buttons, so you can create button flow that starts with a button, so user will just see button on their phone, on their smartphone. They can push on it, you can associate a form, people can fill in information, and then your flow go on and go on. Okay? You can even move some button on the home page of your smartphone if you want, that's possible. Okay, so there are many templates, there are a lot of templates, so every week we get new templates, and that's a big difference between Flow and, for instance, SharePoint Designer. How many people have used SharePoint Designer or create SharePoint Designer workflow? Okay, so we didn't have templates in SharePoint Designer. Now we have plenty in Flow. That's nice. You can also use a template for learning Flow. That's also a good way to learn Flow. Also, this will be provided in the coming month. You will be able to create Flow just by starting from Visio. Or if you have an existing Flow, you can import it in Visio, make some change, and the change will be reflected in Flow. Okay. We have already had this possibility in SharePoint Designer. It didn't work very well. I hope that Microsoft has learned some lesson from this. They told me yes, but we'll see. Okay. So now let's have a demo of Flow, and here I will illustrate an expense report. An expense report, so basically, I will go to Microsoft Teams because that's where most people will live in the future. They will use Microsoft Teams. And in Microsoft Teams, we have the following dashboard: travel expense. So here you can see the expenses that we do with Isabelle in different countries when we travel. And you can see here that the expenses are organized in different categories: entertainment, lodging, meals, transportation. Here you can see green. Green means it's the amount of expenses that has been approved. Of course, approval requires a flow. We'll take a look at the flow behind in a couple of minutes. When it's red, that means it's the amount of expenses rejected. Okay? And of course, the information here comes from a data source. You can use any kind of data source. And in my case, because I'm a SharePointer, I've used a SharePoint list. The SharePoint list is, of course, defined in SharePoint, but my user live in Teams, so they can see the list here. That's a new feature in Microsoft Teams, by the way. You can define a view or a list in SharePoint. You can display it directly in Teams if you want. And here you can see we have different expenses here in different cities. You have the amount, you have the category, etc. And behind this, you have a flow that runs. And when you put a new expense, a flow can automatically start, and the flow will provide information about where it is: in progress, approved, rejected, etc. Okay? You can, if you want, start a flow directly from the SharePoint list. So here you will see flow, and you will see normally travel expense, expense approval, this one here. Okay? You can also start a flow from here if you want. You will see my flow expense approval, or the flow can automatically start. So now let's take a look at the flow which is running behind. The flow is here. Let's find this. Also because the dashboard has been defined in Power BI, you can also keep it in a SharePoint page if you want, instead of using it in Teams, of course. But let's take a look at the flow which is behind this. It's not a big flow, and you see the flow will start when a new item is created. And then I will define a bunch of variables. I don't want to get into the detail. Then we'll check if the amount value of the SharePoint list is greater than a constant, which is, I think, 700 euros. And then, if it's approved, the flow will say, I'm working on it. And then the flow will find the manager. And the logic here is the following. When someone put an expense in a SharePoint list, there are two managers: the main manager, and we have the line manager. Okay? So first, the system will ask the line manager to approve the expense. So first, the flow will find the line manager, which is defined in Active Directory. It's one action, very easy. One action, and you get the line manager. Here, you need to find the main manager. Here, you need to find the line manager. I've defined the line manager in a SharePoint list, so the flow will have to make a lookup in the SharePoint list, find the corresponding line manager, and put some value in there. But before asking the manager to approve or reject the expenses, we will start a discussion in a team, because we have the procurement department that will start a discussion around this expense. So here in Flow, I will just create a discussion in Microsoft Teams. So let's take a look at this discussion. It's here. So it's in team. And I have a team which is, which one? Here. And as you will see there, when I click, yes, here, oh, it worked. Click again. It's a bit slow. Yeah, here I have an expense channel. And here you see a new discussion will start in Microsoft Teams. Okay? And manager will follow this discussion. And then based on this, they will approve or reject. Or they can even start talking about this with the procurement team. Now, the logic is the following. Based on this, the manager will have to approve or reject. So first, I will ask the first manager, the line manager, to approve. Okay? So I will ask the line manager to approve. But the thing is, I want this guy to react on time, because I don't want to wait 1 week before this guy reacts. Okay? So if this guy doesn't react on time, then I will escalate to the big manager, the main manager, the big boss. So you can easily do that in Flow. So you can create this. You can say, if this action run into a timeout, so you can define, for instance, amount of time as 3 days, for instance. If this one run into timeout, then you will fall back to this one. So here you see it's red here. That means this block will run if the previous one ran into an error. If this one, so this one, is timeout. And then I will ask the big boss to approve. And if the big boss doesn't approve on time, then I will loop and I will ask again and again and again until someone approves. You see? So you can create kind of complex approval with Flow today. That's nice, but when you have approval like this, you need to know how efficient is your approval system, who is slow to approve. So you need some dashboard, you need some analytics. So in any action in this flow, I log everything somewhere. In this case, it's in another SharePoint list. And on top of this, we have defined, Isabelle has defined, my Power BI specialist, has defined an analytics. So Isabelle has defined the following dashboard, where I can see the number of flow. I have 7 flow. I can see on average the reaction time. So it took 52.74 reaction time. Well, this is seconds, but normally it's days, of course. I do that for the demo. In average, I have 3 escalation. And then I can go to some specific flow. This was my expense to Las Vegas. When I move the mouse here, I can say, oh, it has been escalated the first time, a second time, a third time, and then finally it has been approved. And I have details on this. I can click and can get more details. This is important for business. Okay? So you can create enterprise application with Microsoft Flow today. It's robust. That works. And I don't work for Microsoft. I'm not part of marketing Microsoft. So you can believe me. Is anybody from Microsoft here? Yeah? Nobody? Okay, so let's go there. I will tell you the truth here. It might be recorded. You're alive. We are live across the world, so thank you for the pressure. Thank you for the pressure. So you have seen, basically, we have approval in Flow, which you can do a lot of things with this, but there are a few problems that I found during some project. First, if your item in the SharePoint list, your expense, get deleted and the flow is already started, what are you going to do? So you have to manage that. That's not easy in Flow. What if the flow is cancelled? You cancel the flow, so you need to change the status in your SharePoint list. You need to say something. What if you want to reassign the improvement? You get an improvement and you say, oh, I want this improvement to be reassigned to my colleague. No, you can, but it's too simplistic. You will see why. It's too simple. It does not work in the real world. There are some limitations that you need to be aware of. For instance, today, maximum duration for a flow is 30 days. In the real world, we have flow, business process, that take more than 30 days. It's a limitation. There's no workaround for this. The approval duration is maximum 30 days. Same issue. There's no workaround. You can have this approval 1 takes 20 days, and approval 2 takes, for instance, 15 days. It's more than 30 days. This happened. The Flow team is aware of that. I've done a lot of pressure on it. And actually, now they are going to extend that to 90 days. You have to know that Flow is based on the Azure engine, which is Azure Logic Apps, which is a massively parallel and robust workflow engine. And Logic Apps is being extended to 1 year. So I guess that in the future, we'll have 1 year. Okay? But short term is 90 days for Flow, and we'll see. Other limitation, you can only have 250 action in a flow. A workaround, you can create nested flow. A flow can call another flow. That is the good practice. Okay, we'll see that later. Also, when you make a do until, you can have loops in Flow, like the do until, there are only 5,000 iteration maximum. After 5,000, you get an exception. Same for the for each, but if you buy plan 1, you can have 100,000 iteration. Okay, we quickly reach 5,000. In the case of SharePoint, you don't have site-level action. So example, if you want an action that creates a list, or if you want an action that allows you to set unique permission to a document, because that's important, for instance, for HR or legal, you cannot do that out of the box. But the good news is, a few weeks ago, so 3 weeks ago, Microsoft shipped a generic action, which is just here, between 2 lines here, which is the send an HTTP action. Send an HTTP action to SharePoint means that you can call the SharePoint REST API from this action. So you can set unique permission, you can create a list, it's not very complicated. Okay? So if you are developers, how many people are developers here? Oh, most of you. Okay, then developers know how to use a REST API. It's quite easy. You can do whatever you want. There's no limitation in SharePoint now with Flow, thanks to this one. Of course, they will provide more out-of-the-box action, but it's just, in the meantime, you have something. Okay? You can also create an Azure function that does what you want, if you want. Huh? So that's also the alternative. So another limitation was that, okay, you create a flow, you have a SharePoint, you want your flow to start if something new happened in SharePoint, but you are SharePoint site owner. SharePoint site owner are supposed to be able to edit anything in the SharePoint site. But you couldn't edit your flow. You have to set another permission in Flow to do that. No, that's over. We have a new thing. This means that when you create your flow, you can say the owner of the flow is the SharePoint list. So here, in the flow, you can have this. You say, this is my SharePoint site, this is my list, and the list is the owner of my flow. So if someone can edit the list, can design the list, then he can design the flow as well. That's great. Okay, so that's actually new. That's important. You can also say this. You can say, we call that run only permission, you can say people who are member of this list, so anyone who can access this list can start the flow manually. That's also new. There are 2 things, 2 different things. We call that run only permission. They shipped that 2 weeks ago, and it works. Okay, there are no state machine. Who know what a state machine is? We have states, you can make go to from one state to the other, etc. Okay, so we have that actually in SharePoint Designer, 2013, right? So there are some situations where you need to do this. Someone create a document, and then you ask a guy or a group of people called advisor, I should have put S here, to approve. And when one of these guys approve, then you will ask the secretariat to approve. And then you will ask the big boss to approve, okay? And he can reject. So then if you reject, you can redirect to the secretariat, back to advisor, etc. You have several levels of approval. If you want to do that with Flow, you will quickly be lost. 2 levels, 3 levels, that's okay, but sometimes you have 10 levels. So that's why we need state machine. We don't have state machine in Flow. We have that in Intex, we have that in K2, but we don't have that in Flow. It can even be worse. You can say here, I'm the boss, I want to redirect to this group of people, or I want to redirect to this group of people, for instance. That's real use case, okay? So there are no state machine, but I've published a workaround, which is you can simulate state machine in Flow. So basically, I have a blog post. If you want more details, go to my blog post. But you will see this. You can create a state machine by writing a do until. You check a variable, which is go to, where you want to go. And so that's a switch. We have switch in Flow. And here, each component here is a state. So you have the state, for instance, val or advisor. You have the state secretariat. You have the state boss. And in the state, you can say, no, I'm coming from here, and I want to go there. So the system will check and will redirect to some part. Okay, that's actually a state machine. It's not complex, it works, it's robust, so you can do it. It has been published to the Microsoft Flow blog team 3 weeks ago. Okay. Now, one problem with Flow is we don't have custom approval form. So let's say the boss here want to reassign the approval to this group of people or to this group of people. That's the business case. What do we have today in Flow? We have this. So when you ask someone to approve, as you know, we have tiles. So people get an email, they can click on approve or reject, or they can go to the Flow approval center when they will get tiles, and they can click on approve, reject, or this 3 button here. And when they do that, they will get this. This is new. So you can say, oh, I click on advanced, I want to reassign. You want to reassign, but you want to reassign to a group of people. What is the group name? You won't see anything, it's blank. You want to see advisors or secretariat or something. So what we need is to be able to change this form, to bring some custom information. So we cannot do that today. So you have to be aware of that before starting a project with Flow. Okay? I wish I had more time to explain this, but that's very important. Now, Flow run in the cloud. Okay? So as I told you before, it ran on top of an extremely robust engine that run millions of Flow every hours. That's logic apps. It's robust. But in many cases, your data are on-prem. That's a real world. In real big companies, the data are on-prem. So we can connect Flow and on-prem. Isabelle?
Yes. So to do that, you can use a feature that we also use in Power BI world. So to manage data on-premise and Flow, you will use what we call the on-premise data gateway. I don't know if you...
How many people have used that on-prem data gateway? A few, okay, good.
Okay, so what it is exactly? Actually, it's a service we will run on premises, and it will act as a secure channel between the services in the cloud. So I mean by that Power BI, Power Apps, Flow, and of course, Azure Logic Apps. And the beauty is that you don't need to expose your on-premise data source. It's the data gateway who will do the job. There is plenty of data source available.
Yeah, there are many of them.
Yeah. You can even work with files, scripts, and REST API web service. Also, they are not all possible in Flow, I think.
Yeah, exactly. Even though if you go to the documentation of the data gateway, they will say you can connect with all these data sources. You might not have all the action, the Flow action that allow you to connect to this data source. So you have to double check. Example, SAP, you don't have SAP in Flow. You have it in Logic Apps, not in Flow yet. So you have to double check that. I've created a blog post that show you how to create a PowerShell script and how to run it on the server side. That's possible with the on-prem data gateway.
There is always a blog post. Huh?
There is always a blog
for
post.
each slide.
Yes.
But also, yes, something important, because the data gateway is now there for a few years and it evolves all the time. Now you are also able to have a kind of cluster of data gateway. So you can use more than one in your configuration, because in enterprise world...
Yeah, we will take a look at this now.
Yeah.
If you want, Isabelle?
Yes,
Okay.
sure.
Okay, yes, before going into the demo, I would like to tell you this. SharePoint 2019 and Microsoft Flow are becoming friends. Same for Power Apps. So that means in SharePoint list or SharePoint document library, you will see the Flow and the Power Apps menu, okay? And you will be able to start a Flow or a Power Apps from SharePoint on-prem, even though we can already do that today. So let's take a look at on-prem. So here, I've installed a SQL Server database on my laptop here, so which is my data center, small data center. I've installed and configured the on-prem data gateway, which is here. And here, as you can see here, in my SQL Server, I have a table in this database, which gets information provided by Flow. Actually, the information here are information coming from Twitter. So if you have a hashtag with Azure in Twitter, then you have a flow that take it, send it to cognitive service. Cognitive service will say if it's good or bad or whatever, and we store it in this SQL Server database. Okay? I don't want to show you the flow because it's quite basic. But the thing is, to manage this list, I have another flow that cleans the list. So I have a basic flow here. You run the flow, and it's called a store procedure in SQL Server database on-prem, and it deletes all the hashtags. So let's run this, just to show you that it works. It's for fun, huh? But run the flow, and now, voila. Let's check, and the table is empty. So it works very well, okay? So in the real world, you have to be careful because you still need to configure some port in your proxy when you use the on-prem data gateway. So some specific port need to be open. So I don't want to get into the detail, but it's not just click, 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 click for installing it, okay? You have to be serious with that.
But there is an excellent white paper about all the specification and troubleshooting if needed.
Yes.
So
we can quickly talk about environment, Isabelle? Environment. How many people have used environment in Flow? Just to see. You did, okay. Okay, so I will explain. So the idea is, okay, you can create flow, but you will create many flows, and by default, they are all in the same place. So what you might need is to organize your flow in different places. These different places are called environment, okay? If you can create environment, but you need a specific plan. By default, in Office 365, you have only a default environment. So you need to buy plan 1 or plan 2, plan 1, I think, okay, to create the flow. So you can organize them in different environments. So for instance, you might need environment for HR, so flow for HR will be an environment for HR, flow for marketing, flow for operation, flow for legal. So you will create different environment, different places for this different flow. Why? Because, well, first to organize them, but also because you might have some data loss prevention rule. You might say this: the marketing department need to analyze Twitter. So they need to be able to use the Twitter action if they need, okay? But the legal and the operation environment don't need Twitter. It's even dangerous. So I want to prevent using Twitter in legal flow. So you can say, I create an environment called legal, and you can define a rule where you can say this and this and this action cannot be used in this environment. That's basically the idea. So if you need that, you can. So I will go, example, you can create an environment for dev marketing, environment for test marketing, environment for UAT marketing, environment for production marketing. You can do that for dev operation, test operation, US, UAT, production, etc. You can even have associated database. We call that the common data service. And you can specify this. In this environment, I want it to be localized in, for instance, Europe. And then when you create the database will be stored in Europe and your flow will run in Europe. For some companies, that is important. Okay? I don't want to spend too much time in environment, even though that's interesting, but we are lack of time. You need to know this when you use environment. You can export flow from one environment to the other. You have dev, test, UAT, production. You can do that. That works. But when you export and you import, you have to redefine your connection all the time. So the flow team is working on it to make that more automatic. Okay. Also, if you use the on-prem data gateway, only flow running in the default environment can communicate with the on-prem. So if you create an HR environment and you want to create flow in there, it won't be able to communicate with on-prem. It's only the default environment. That's also important to know before starting a project. Okay, now, very important. How can my flow communicate with the outside world, and how can the outside world communicate with flow? What's the business scenario here? The business scenario is this. First, you might want to create a form, a Power Apps, and Power Apps need to be able to call flow. Typically, That's what I've done 2 weeks ago. My customer want me to create a form where people can ask for a Power BI group to be created. Because the Power BI group needs some specific naming convention, not defined in Azure Active Directory. Okay? So what I did is I did create a Power Apps, and then the Power Apps call the Graph API to create a group. And the Graph API, the call to Graph API is done in Flow. And if I want, I can put an approval. In this case, they didn't want approval, but if I want, I could put approval in there. Okay? So, and also, you want Flow to be able to return information back to Power Apps. Okay? So how can we do that? Let me show you this. So first, I will go to Teams, because that's where all my users live. And I will show an example of Power Apps. I see that my team client is a bit slow. And here you can see I have a tab called Form. So when I click here, I will see my Power Apps form that allow me to create expenses, for instance. Okay, so you can get this. So this is all my expenses. So I can, and I see the status. One expense is open, the other one is pending, the other one is approved, etc. So of course, the approval is set by Microsoft Flow. Okay, and if you want, you click, for instance, one which is, yeah, we can take this one. And you can say down below, submit, and then you will call a flow if you want. Okay? So how does that work? It's actually very easy. The idea is you do, let me find the flow. Yes, voila. What you need is this. If you want Power Apps to call a flow, the first action in your flow must be the Power Apps action. That's it. And you can pass parameters. Okay, this is not new. We had that since the beginning of Flow. Now, if you want Flow to return action to Power Apps, for instance, a user wants to create a group, the Flow check, and Flow say, hey, this group with this name already exists, for instance, example, right? You can do this, and this is new, respond to Power Apps. Okay, so communication is quite easy. So, other example of communication with the outside world, a custom application need to call Flow. Why is that interesting? Because in companies, you have different platforms, different languages, not just Microsoft language, not just Windows, and you can create a PHP application that can use Flow. For instance, for the approval, because you like the approval which is in Flow, or for many other reasons. Okay? So if you want to do this, you can create a flow that will act as a web service. I call that a flow as a service. And to do this, you need the first action in your flow, which is actually the trigger, to be the request trigger. Just put that. Okay? Let's take a look at this. I will show you an example, a basic example, which is where, oh, I've lost it. Let me find it again, which is nested flow here. Here we go. And here, it's very basic. The first action here, which is the trigger, is when an HTTP request is received. When you do this, automatically, when you will save your flow, you will get a public URL that the outside world can call. You can also specify a JSON schema, example here. In the schema, I'm specifying that I want to get an email address, an email subject, and an email body. Okay? So when you do this, automatically what you put here will be seen as a variable. And you can use that in Flow. Example, I get information, and then I will send an email to this guy, for instance. And then, if you want, you can return value back to the caller. That's a response object. Example, I haven't created a custom application, but I'm using Postman, which is an open source application, which allow you to call this public URL. And I will pass this. Email is brianc@sharequel.com. Hello, I will say hello what? Hello Madrid. Oh, Madrid. And hello from Madrid. Okay, send. This will call the flow, and the flow will send an email. You see, I get success. And if you go to the Brian C email address, you should see hello Madrid and hello from Madrid. Okay, just right away. So that works. So it's very easy. And it is important, this one. Other scenario, you want to call the outside world. What does that mean? You have an API, example, the weather API, which allow you to get the weather on some specific location, or you want to call the Microsoft Graph because you want to do something which is not defined in Flow, like creating a group, for instance, okay? Creating a team, or whatever you want. And then we have the HTTP action. So this one is the joker. I call that the joker. Because with this, you can do whatever you want. So I use that all the time, the HTTP action. And you can define the API you want to use, the REST API you want to use. So that's really the one you need to master, the HTTP. Now, if the API you want to call is the SharePoint API, then you have to use the send an HTTP request to SharePoint, the one I mentioned before, and then you can call anything in SharePoint. Anything, no limitation. Okay? You can also create a custom connector. So to do this, you need to create a REST API, and you need to describe the REST API by defining a Swagger file or an Open API file, which is a bit beyond the scope of this session, even though I like this. But voila. So here is summarized all the scenario that you will get through if you want to communicate with the outside world. The first one is probably the most popular, Power Apps. And Power BI, because there is a communication possible between Power BI and Flow. Isabelle?
Yes. So, how they will interact? Actually, the most common scenario is just that you have a flow. The flow will write or update some data in a data source, and then you will build a dashboard on top of it. It's like the expenses report.
That's the dashboard you have seen, right? So it's no very common scenario.
But there is a more exciting way to do that.
Yeah, because this one needs to be schedulely refreshed, this one. Huh?
Yes,
so
absolutely.
It's not live refresh. It can take a...
So it's a classical data warehouse analysis reporting stuff. You can also use what we call a live streaming data set into Power BI for the people who are using it. So Flow can be exposed as this live data set, meaning that you will see in your dashboard the number running all the time.
In live mode.
And that's really interesting. But you can also, the other way around, you can use what we call the data alert into Power BI, meaning that you can trigger a flow from an alert in Power BI. So if Serge is in Las Vegas spending all the company money, I can receive an alert. And the flow can do something about that. Yes, we can.
Do it.
Okay.
Let me show the browser.
Yeah.
Windows is open right here.
This one. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So here I have a tile. In this tile, we have defined the data alert here, manage alert. Then we have the name alert for company expense. That's important.
That's how we have named it.
Yeah.
And the logic?
So the logic is that when he will, the total amount of expense will be above 30 million, I think. The default is to send an email, but we can also use Microsoft Flow, and maybe you can show what will happen.
Exactly. Remember this alert name, alert for company expenses, that's how I've named it. And let's define a flow. Well, let's take a look at the flow, which is the...
Power BI data alert, just there.
Yeah, here. Power BI data alert. And actually, it's very simple. The first action, actually the trigger in this flow, must be the Power BI trigger. That's it. And in there, you can just get there. You just specify the alert. So you have a drop-down box, a combo box, a drop-down box. And you can scroll through all the alerts, like the one I showed you before, alert for company expense. And voila, that's as simple as that. Then your flow will be triggered. And then you can send a notification to the management or do whatever you want. Okay? So that's very easy, and it should be easy.
It's like Lego, actually.
It's a Lego. It's like Lego. Okay, thank you. We can talk a little bit about the pricing, but maybe not all the detail of pricing. Most people use the Flow subscription, which is provided with Office 365. There are some limitations with this, like, for instance, you can only use one custom connector with this one. So you can only call one API. Well, if you create your custom connector, there's only one. But of course, if you know the API, you can call the HTTP action to call many API if you want. But by default, it's only one custom connector. That's a limitation. If you want more, you have to buy Flow Plan 1 or Flow Plan 2. Also, what you need to remember is that in Office 365, the number of flow is limited to 2,000 by user. But by user, all combined across the company. So that means it's like in the storage in SharePoint Online. It's everything combined. So if your colleague doesn't use Flow, actually you can use this quota. That's automatic. So if you have 10 users in Office 365, 10 license, then you can use 20,000 run. Okay? That's a good news. And if you want to buy more run, it's not that expensive. You just pay $40, which is actually almost 40 euro in Europe, and you get 50,000 additional run, which is actually fair. Okay? There are other features that you need to be aware of, like in the other plan, you get connectors to premium services, like connector to Salesforce, connectors to Adobe, Adobe electronic signature, to Oracle, etc. So if you want that, you need to buy Plan 2. Some advices. So some advices to summarize some things. When you create flow-based application or workflow-based application, not just for flow, this is true for an Intex as well, okay, too, keep your form as simple as possible. If you have business logic, put the business logic in the flow, in the workflow, not in the form, or less in the form. You don't have to be religious about that. You have to be just, that's common sense. Use environment when you need environment. What about the accounts? Because when you create a flow, the flow can be run by any user. If a new expense is created in my SharePoint, then any user can trigger the flow. So that means you need to use connectors, of course. And in the connectors, you need to specify an account. So the good practice is, for enterprise flow, you can define a system account. So buy an Office 365 license just for system account and use this one in your flow. Don't use personal account for enterprise flow. If you create personal flow, then you can use personal account. Okay? Be aware of all the limitations I mentioned before. You can create state machine if you remember the pattern I've shown you before. Don't forget that Flow is an application, like any other application, so error can happen. So you can manage errors. In the next slide, I will show you how to manage error in Flow. Don't forget that when a flow calls the outside world, it can take a while. There is a limitation. The timeout by default is 90 seconds, if I remember well. So there is a pattern that I've defined that allows you to manage long time call, several hours if you want. It's defined in the slide. There are PowerShell now. Now we can use PowerShell to manage flow, and there are many reasons for using PowerShell in Flow. One of the reasons is GDPR, the monster, GDPR. Because when you run a flow, you need to be able to find all the flow managed by your user, company user. You need to know who approved, who ran the flow, and if user want, you should be able to remove all this information. So by using PowerShell, you can. That's mainly for GDPR, but you can do many other things with PowerShell. We still have 5 minutes, I think. Now, to get back to the pattern, you want to call a service that takes a while. How can you do that? I've noticed that there is a timeout. So the idea is you have to use the HTTP action, but HTTP webhook. So let's say you want to call this service, which is somewhere. In my case, my service is a flow, but it could be whatever you want. This is the URL for the service. So you call it. It will take 2 hours to perform. And you can do this. You have to pass a callback function. So that means the pointer to your flow. And we have a function in Flow, which is new, which allows you to define this. it's the function or the expression list callback URL. Pass it to the external service, okay? You can pass additional parameters if you want. And now I will show you the other service. This one here. And of course, this one will have to manage this value. This is the service. In my case, the service is a flow because I like using flow, but it could be whatever you want. So you get the callback from here. You run, it can take hours or days if you want. And when it's finished, call HTTP and send the callback here in the URL. And you can provide some value. And that works. You can go to my blog post to get more details, but basically, I've summarized that in this slide. You will be able to download the slide. Also, errors. Errors happen. So the good practice is put your code in a scope. Example here, you have scope, so you can put your scope in scope. And you can have, for instance, the main scope. So here we have many actions behind this one. And you can say, if this one failed, then you will get into there. And then you can send notification to the administrator or something. 5 minutes, 4 minutes, okay. Okay? So, conclusion. The tool is nice, so you can use it in production. It competes with third parties, more and more. But there is room for improvement, to be polite. 2 weeks ago, I gave the same session with a guy from the Flow team, so that's why I mentioned room for improvement. Before that, it was problems, but now I'm a bit more polite. So the workflow engine, which is Logic Apps, is very, very, very robust and scalable, so you can trust it. The problem is the connectors, all the connectors don't have the same quality. So check them, check the connectors. Okay? So don't say Flow is a tool. It's not a tool, it's something amazing behind. But the connectors could be problematic. You don't have state machine, but we have a pattern for achieving state machine. Approval forms cannot be customized so far, but they are working on it. I don't know when this will ship. We used to call that task form in SharePoint, SharePoint approval. Sometime in Flow, the user needs some basic JSON knowledge. So this is a bit too complicated sometimes. But the Flow team wants to get rid of that, okay? To get rid of all the visible JSON. Don't forget, flow duration 30 days, approval 30 days, so this can be a weakness. But they're working on it. The good things, positive things, is that the tool is quite easy. It's not just SharePoint, it's many other hosts, many other containers. You can use it with Dynamics, SharePoint, whatever. It replaced SharePoint Designer workflows officially. You have connection to hundreds of services, 250 something. So that's a strength. Also, you can communicate with on-prem, and you can have more with SharePoint 2019, where in on-prem you will see the menu. And the integration with SharePoint is getting better. You have seen who owns the list, who owns the flow, the list can own the flow, etc. So you will see more and more integration with SharePoint. SharePoint is really key in flow strategy. And perhaps Power BI integration are very interesting and get better and better. Okay, so voila, quickly, a quick tour of Microsoft Flow and what you need to know. Also, the Flow team is very proactive. So it delivers, so every 2 weeks we get new stuff, like in Team, like in Power BI, we get a lot of things. And they listen to the experience. Okay. Voila, quick tour. Thank you very much. We still have time for questions or not?
For 1 minute.
We have 1 or 2 minutes for questions.
Questions.
Don't be shy. Yes.
¿Alguna pregunta?